Good afternoon. We're excited to have in our midst today with our review with our data with NWEA, who's here to present to us, just the three of us present right now, but we're scheduled to begin at 3:30, and we'll imagine that there will be others that will be coming. So again, we're glad to have you here with us today, and we can begin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Reverend Mack, Board of Trustee members, and Superintendent Postaway. During the first part of this board workshop today, Dr. Andy Hegedus with NWA Research and Consulting Director and Dr. Beth Tarasawa, the Vice President of Research with NWA, will be presenting MAP data related to the NWA Insights Report and providing an opportunity for board members to ask questions. Dr. Andrew Hegedus consults with educators across the country and manages large research projects focused on understanding the drivers for growth in schools with differing levels of challenges. Dr. Hegedus is also a Broad Superintendent's Academy Fellow. His research on poverty and school performance has been featured on outlets such as NPR, Education Dive, Ed Week, and Future Ed. Dr. Beth Tarasawa leads a talented team of researchers devoted to transforming education research through advancements in assessment, growth measurement, and the availability of longitudinal data. She also collaborates with universities, foundations, and school districts to produce rigorous and accessible education policy research. Dr. Tarasawa's research focuses on issues related to education equity, particularly those concerning social class, race, and linguistic diversity. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Hegedus and Dr. Tarasawa.
Thank you so much. As Buffy introduced, I'm Dr. Tarasawa out of NWA's Research Department. We're also joined by Allison Levitt here in the audience. She's on our partner accounts team, and she has been working with Charleston County for several years. And she actually oversees a lot of our larger systems in the South, and is a proud product of Charleston County Schools herself. So before we start, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce Dr. Hegedus' work, also to ground us a bit in the material we're about to dive into more deeply. It's always an honor for NWA to sit alongside board members, school district administrators, and principal and building leadership to really kind of roll our sleeves up and dive deeply into the data and understand patterns that we see, and actually patterns that we can't answer with our data. So to begin with, Dr. Hegedus will talk about some of the national trends. He'll also talk about our measures to just make sure we have the same language and understanding of our measurements, as well as the precision of growth in which we exert. I also want to take just a minute to think about what NWA and our partnering to help all kids learn mission really means. And we do really appreciate the opportunity to work with school districts like yourselves to think about the schools and the systems and the kids and the communities that we are charged with serving. And I bring that up partially to understand and to give us some grace as we enter this data to think about the types of communities that we are interacting with. And I think Charleston, like many of our systems, have some of the most affluent communities in the country, but also have communities that are serving historically marginalized and traditionally underserved kids, as well as more recent arrivals such as immigrant, undocumented, and refugee families that bring sometimes English language learner resources and needs as well. So we are charged still with meeting all these kids who are coming from vastly different circumstances, and to acknowledge that a lot of those inequalities are outside of the public school system that have residential and historically economic conditions, yet we are, again, as a public school entity, really charged with meeting those kids where they are. And with that, I'll let Dr. Hegedus take us into Charleston Public.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I apologize if I'm coughing. I've had a cough for about a week, and I just can't quite get rid of it. So if I stop midway, you'll understand. Part of my experience with doing board workshops is the more interactive they are, the better off we are. So please feel free to stop at any point, ask questions. The intent of Beth and I being here is to really help you understand the data and understand what you're looking at, so then you can make much better strategic choices for the district overall. And so if you have any questions at all, please stop and ask. What we thought we'd do is, as Beth said, is go through just some national research first, just to give sort of a big perspective on things, get into a little bit of our tool itself. That'll probably take about 20 minutes-ish. And then from there, we'll go into Charleston data itself and get into the insight report. Does that sound okay with everyone? Is a way to go? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, so let's start with national research. This is an excerpt from the New York Times. It's actually from a couple of years ago. There's a researcher out of Stanford named Sean Reardon who's working very hard to take state test data, because that's all the public data that we have available, and put it into a national database, normalize it all, sort of get all the different state tests on the same kind of scale. And so he takes third grade and fifth grade data and looks at it. And so this is actually, there's an interactive tool in the New York Times that you can go play with if you wanted to. But what it shows is that there's a very strong relationship between achievement and income in a school district. You know, nationally, if average performance of third graders, you can see like Milwaukee and Chicago, which serve more students that come from poverty, as opposed to Anne Arundel County that is fairly wealthy, right? And so the achievement in those has this relationship to poverty. What's interesting is that when you look at growth, right, so how much kids learn in a district, there really isn't that strong a relationship between it. There is some. You can see that there's sort of, if you're going to draw a line through there, with more wealth in a district, you can see, you know, some more growth. But there's a nice distribution sort of around average. And so what that means is income in a district doesn't mandate how much kids learn, right? It's what happens in the district and happens in schools. So the best growing one, for instance, is Chicago, you know, and it's huge. And they have, in Sean's study, have shown that there's about 6 years of learning that kids get in 5 years of school. So that's one of the best in the country, right? Similarly, the study that I published in October that, that got some national press as well did same review but at schools. So the nice thing about our database is that we test about 20% of the kids in the country. So I took a sample and got 1,500 schools in the sample and did the same thing and looked at the income, and you can see that there's a strong relationship between the income in a school, right, and the achievement. So the more money the school has, the higher achieving kids are. 100% poverty schools, their achievement is 34th percentile, 30-ish percentile in that neighborhood, and schools that are very high wealth typically are in the 70th percentile achievement. So major discrepancy, but when you look at growth across the whole distribution of free and reduced lunch, you can see that there are wealthy schools that serve kids well, and there are wealthy schools that don't. And there are high poverty schools that serve kids well, and there are high poverty schools that don't. So, so it's really what happens in the school for kids that really makes the determinant, right? So to just explain that a little bit more, let's dive into a school a little bit. The green bars represent the percentage of students in the school that are, if you're looking at that left-hand bar, those are the students that are the lowest achieving kids. So kids that are between the first and the 9.9th percentile. The next bar is between 10 and 20, 20 and 30. And you can see all the way on the right, there are kids that are at 90th percentile and higher, so very high achieving kids. Right? So that's what a profile of a low achieving school looks like. Right? It's skewed down to the low end so that overall, when you look at their performance, it's low performing, but they've got very high achieving kids in that school as well, right? So they serve a whole distribution of kids. It's just they're more skewed to the low end. The blue bars represent how much growth there is for each of those groups of kids. So the zero axis is the national average growth. So this is a school that's growing every group of kids better than average. This school, similar low achievement school, they're serving low achieving kids, but that profile, now the lowest achieving kids are growing even more. So that is a school we'd call doing catch-up growth, right? Because all their kids are growing at least at the national average, but they're growing some groups of kids even more than that. Does that make sense? Okay. So what's interesting about thinking about these schools and how they're serving the different groups of kids is if we took that first school where their kids were like achieving at the 20th percentile, right? Let me go back for a second. So that one on the left-hand side. So their kids are achieving at the 20th percentile, right? So low, but they're growing their kids at the 72nd on average. So better than 7 out of 10, right? Their kids are growing better than 7 out of 10 kids. So if you pick a kid up at the 20th percentile and you grow them better than 7 out of 10, and then, you know, from the fall to the spring, and then you get summer, and then you pick them up again in 4th grade, fall to spring. This is where Proficiency is in South Carolina. So if you take one of those kids and you grow them really well, better than 7 out of 10, it takes about 5 years to get a kid's achievement up to that proficiency level. And that's if you do it every year, in every grade, right? So you get that consistent high level of growth without variation. The other interesting thing about this is I get a question a lot like, hey, we're growing really well, but we don't see achievement for the school really changing, right? So if I was going to put a dot on there to represent just overall achievement of that school, let's say that would be my dot, right? It's sort of in the middle, and that would be sort of represent overall how that school is doing, right? From my engineering days, I'd call this a system that's in equilibrium. It's just constant, right? You've got kids that come in at the same level, they grow a lot, they leave. And then the next year, kids come in and kids leave. So even though they're growing kids a lot, that green dot is not going to move, right? So you're not going to see, even though this school is serving kids really well, achievement is going to stay in that same point. The only way to move achievement is do two things, right? You can either bring them in a little bit higher, right? So invest in preschool, early education, right? And bring them in higher, then you can move that dot up, or grow them even better than 7 out of 10 kids, right? Or more consistently between grades. So, so for us, when looking at growth is sort of a better indicator of what's really happening within schools. Ultimately, the outcome we want is achievement, but really growth gives you a better indication of what's happening in the schools and how well the students are being served within the school. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So the one on the left is that one we talked about that's doing catch-up growth, right? If we just looked at achievement and like that state accountability system rated that school an F because it's not achieving at high levels, but they're already doing catch-up growth like we talked about, right? The school on the right in this case, they're not growing any group of kids at the average. Every group of kids is growing below the national average. If you look at a state accountability system, when this data came in, right, they were rated 1 star, which is as low as you could get. So that was based on achievement, and it didn't really differentiate growth. The state accountability didn't differentiate on the growth. But sitting in your chair or sitting in the superintendent's chair, you probably want to think about those schools completely differently, right? The school on the left is one you'd want to support because the kids that come in, they're growing them well, they're doing catch-up growth. That's what you want to have happen. The school on the right, they're not growing them at the national average, and so what do you do with that school, and how do you get them to grow at least at the national average or higher? Does that good? Okay? Okay. So as an aspirational goal, you want high growth in all your schools, in all grades, in all subjects, for all kids, every year. That's what you're looking for, right? If you do that, then you're serving kids well. That's really hard, right? That's why it's an aspirational goal. To get that to happen is what we're all shooting for in education. Welcome. There was that cough. So a friend of mine, Tom Payzant, who was superintendent in Boston Public Schools back in the 2000s, he was noted at the time because he was superintendent of Boston Public for 8-10 years, which is typically unheard of. He was a gentleman and made amazing changes in Boston Public. One of the things that he imparted to me is that it's important for districts to sort of set their strategy and stick with it because change takes time. And if things keep changing, then educators can become cynical about, you know, what's the new program coming in this year. And so really it's the change and all the bumps in the road, if we can turn around those low-performing schools based on a commitment and then staying focused to that commitment, that's how he found the best results when he was working with Boston. Okay, so that sort of wraps up the national perspective piece. Do you have any questions on that part? Did all that make sense? Was that worth your time for me to do that
Yes.
stuff?
Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's get a little bit into MAP itself then. I know you've had MAP here in Charleston for a very long time, but I don't know how familiar you personally are with it. So I just want to hit some of the highlights about MAP Growth and what makes it unique and different. So the very first thing is we have a phenomenal group of people on our content team, and they're the people that actually write the questions. And they're the people that choose which questions go into the item bank to be seen by kids. They make sure that the very first thing they do is they go to your state standards and they unpack the standards. They break them down to understand what do the standards really want kids to know and be able to do, what's the intended rigor of those questions, and then they write questions that go right after those standards. And then they go through a number of checks, and one of the checks that they go through as well is after they've been in the field, after they've gotten a number of responses, then they go through a bias and sensitivity review and something called a DIF review, which is differential item functioning. But basically what it means is we check to see if boys and girls answer the question differently. Or do African American students and white students answer the question differently, right? So we're checking to make sure that the items themselves respond uniformly regardless of who answers the question. So then we put them into operation, and then they're in the test and available for kids to see, right? So that's how we make sure that the test is not slanted towards one group of students or another. Then
May I ask a question?
you may, please do.
So you said you unpack the standards, and states write their standards, and then those standards create textbooks. And those textbooks generally have chapters and summaries and questions. How come you create your own questions as opposed to using the ones created within the textbooks that have been approved by the states that back it up on more approved the standard?
Well, one easy reason is copyright. But typically we need a lot more questions than there are in a textbook. And that's because we create a custom test for every child based on their achievement level. So we have to have a very big and robust item bank that can deal with very low achieving kids, very high achieving kids, and everything in the middle.
And that doesn't exist unless you create it in-house?
Yeah, basically. There are ones that are, we call formative item banks, where some other vendors have ones where you can pull questions from their item bank and create a teacher-created test, for instance. aligned to standards. But we want our items to be secure so that kids don't know them in advance.
So you purposely want them to be questions that have never been seen before in a textbook?
Correct. We want them to make sure that nobody's seen them, but they're measuring what the standards say need to be measured. So we do it for security reasons, but even if a kid sees a question, we'll lock it out for them for 14 months so that they can't see it again, so that the next time they come in, we're getting a true measure of what they know and can do, rather than, oh yeah, I saw this one, I know the answer's A, and moving on from there.
You said that you do bias reviewing or testing of your questions, and I heard a couple of things. I've also taught urban-rural because there's so many biases, and I have read standardized tests that I think were very culturally biased. So how do you do that? Or how many things can you test for, I guess?
Yeah, so Beth and I joke that she would be my color commentary, when I'm explaining, so please jump in anytime. So before we'll calibrate an item to say what number it is, we have to have at least about 1,500 responses from kids.
Okay.
And then we take those 1,500 responses and we slice them by different sets of data that we have about kids: race, gender, location, et cetera, right? So we'll look at different subsets of the data to make sure that kids have about the same score in general, right? So that each of those groups, if this is supposed to be a 200 level, 200 RIT point, which is our scale item, that all the kids, the different groups, are answering it about the same.
Okay.
Yeah, we also have some external bias reviews, so in particular states or contracts that we're working with. So you can imagine, like with Alaska or with our Bureau of Indian Education, for example, there's some cultural lenses that we add in addition to our standard master database. And so we have these measurement or psychometric properties that make sure that roughly gender and racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic background differences don't exist. But then we can have an external measure above and beyond that for, say, different animals that might mean something in an indigenous population. So we have those additional pieces as well.
Thank you.
So when I said we create a test, one of the things that makes MAP unique, and back to your question about the textbooks before, one of the things that the standards do is that they assign a grade level to a certain thing children should know, like fractions is a 4th grade thing, right? We don't look at it that way. We look at it in terms of kids of different ages can have different ability levels and know different things. So what our test will do is it will ask a question, and if the student gets it right, the next question will be a little bit harder. And if the next question's right, it'll be a little bit harder, and if they get that wrong, the next question will be a little easier. And so our question creates a custom test for each student with the idea of, let's measure each student accurately, same amount of error around the measurement, regardless if they're a student that's low achieving like a 202 or that they're high achieving like a 236. We're going to measure those kids with equal precision. Once we know where they are, then we'll put it into a context, right? So once we know where a student is, then we'll say, oh, that's about average for 3rd grade. Or that's a really high achieving 3rd grader. Or, wow, that would be proficient on their state test, right? But our job first is to measure what they know and then put it in context from there. Does that make sense? Your forehead is all scrunched up. I want to make sure I'm addressing you. You're good? Yeah, you. You're good? Okay. Just trying to read my crowd,
Do you
Okay.
correlate those back to the state assessments? How accurate are you in South Carolina?
Generally, we predict whether a student's proficient or not proficient, 85, 80%, 87% correct. Yep. So if you just have one data point about a kid, You can do a lot of things, right? You can use that data point to say, let's screen for gifted and talented, let's look at their grade reading, let's differentiate our instruction and put kids in flexible groups based on similar achievement levels, let's look at them for college readiness, let's see how they're going to do on state tests. We give data to teachers as well about a student's instructional level so that they can ladder lessons and they can pick good reading materials for kids, and we tie them to instructional content providers so that there can be some work done with students on Edmentum or Achieve 3000 or other programs that are there for kids to spend some time working by themselves, right, with technology to improve. And when we give a number to a teacher, the number's important for some uses, but for teaching, what's important is typically that develop column right there. So if a student's like a 205 student, they're right in the middle of that develop column. That means that they know enough, they have enough background to work on identify acute or obtuse angles, but they're not so far along that that would be boring for them, right? So we want to work with students to develop their skills right in that zone of proximal development, which is what we measure, right? And so we give that information to teachers, and they can see, okay, I can reinforce right angles, but I can move on to identify acute, obtuse angles with kids, and what's coming next, right, is identifying perpendicular lines and all that stuff. So this is information provided to the teachers to help them with instruction in their classroom. Once we get 2 data points, now we're talking about growth, right? So if a student has a 202 when we measure them the first time and a 216 when we measure them the second time in mathematics, they've grown 14 points just like a kid with height, right? You measure them at one point in time, you measure them another point in time, you know how many inches they grew, same thing here. And with 2 data points, you can do student goal setting, right? You can say, hey, typically across the country, kids grow 14 points, kids grow 12 points, let's set a goal for you. And then you can use it for district and school improvement because you can compare the growth of kids to growth across the country. You can look at change in learning over time, you can do program evaluation, you can do all kinds of stuff with the growth data. So how we put the numbers in context, we have to figure out what typical is, right? We have to figure out what sort of average growth for a kid would be. And so there's 4 factors that go into it. One is, well, what grade's the student in? The second is, well, what subject are we talking about, right? So, okay, we're going to talk about what typical growth would be for 4th grade math. But then we get unique in that we start looking at, okay, well, where's the student starting? What's their starting achievement? So we'll look at what's typical for a low achieving student, what's typical for a high achieving student, and we take that into account, and then we also take into account how much time has elapsed. So if a student has 29 weeks of instruction or a student has 35 weeks of instruction, you'd expect the student who has 35 weeks to have grown more, right? So we take all that stuff into account. And we say, okay, typical would be 12 points. We know there's a distribution of kids around that, but average would be about 12 points of growth. And then we do some other work and turn that into a national percentile. So now you can compare the growth of any of your students to kids across the country, right? Where we're taking into account where they start, taking into account how much instruction they've had. So it's a very robust way of looking at student performance and identifying are the kids in your district growing the way you expect them to, right, or the way we typically see. One note is the blue there shows like how easy it is to grow kids. And you can see, sometimes kids grow almost nothing and sometimes kids grow 25 points, right? When we start getting groups of kids together, it's harder to get bigger amounts of growth.
Say that one more time. Last part.
So it's easier to move an individual student a lot than it is to move a whole classroom or a whole grade a lot, right? And what that looks like in that picture is you can see how compressed the yellow is when we're talking about grade level growth. And so if a kid grew like 2 more points than typical, their growth would be 62nd percentile, so better than 6 out of 10. If you could grow a grade level 2 more points than average, that would be better than 8 out of 10. So
How does that equate
just
to
a little,
class-
it's harder to move a group of kids than it is one kid.
How does that equate to classroom size?
Yep. So the bigger the class, the bigger the grade, the bigger your district, right? The harder it is to move that number.
Not bigger the district, the bigger the class.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep.
So combining classes
That's
doesn't
what I'm
necessarily,
saying.
combining classes, that may not be a good solution if you want to move kids forward. So a class with 25 here and a class with 19 here, to put them all in one class would be quite a challenge.
Well, I don't want to say that. I'm saying from a
Right.
data perspective,
Right, me too.
it's harder, the bigger the number, the harder it is to see the movement in the data. Educationally, depending on your context and why you're putting groups of classes together, educationally, it may be a great thing to do. I'm just saying from a data perspective, the larger the group is, the harder it is to move the number.
You see better results with smaller numbers. Or more results, I'll say.
I want to be careful because we're here to talk about the data and not necessarily what best practice is educationally in a classroom, because that sort of depends on the context, what's right for this group of kids in this school, with the kids they're serving and the teachers you have and all that. So I guess my point is just the larger you have, the harder it is to move that number up. And so you may, as you're thinking about evaluating grades and classes and schools, you need to just think about how big a group of students they're serving as part of your judgment or part of your questioning as you get into the data. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. I understood the first time.
Okay. Perfect lead into the slide, which is then goal setting depends on your context. It depends on your schools, on the students you're serving. It depends on where your schools are starting. Depends on what the past success of your past efforts were. How much resource you're investing in the change. The power of the strategies you're picking. How those strategies have worked for other people, right? So all those things sort of come together as you're having conversations between the board and administration on, okay, so we've got our strategic plan, we're setting goals. What are the goals for the school? What are the goals for the district? All those things factor into how aggressive you are in terms of setting numbers and holding, those numbers, holding people to hitting those numbers. Does that make sense? Like you might, as an example, you might pick a professional development strategy, right, where you can begin over a year or 2 years, depending on how it's rolled out, to begin to see changes in the classroom in terms of teachers' behavior. But it may take a little while to actually see the growth numbers change. So you may, as you're laying out the numbers, say, okay, we're going to be steady, steady, steady. Now we're going to see the bump in year 3.
You're saying that achievement is lagging behind the other factors.
Correct. Yep, first you've got to see behavioral change. Once you see behavioral change, then you can begin to see growth change. And once you see growth change, then you can begin to see achievement change.
So when you back it up, though, to data, as you said, and specifically to the South Carolina standards, we're fixing to go into some data about spring, fall to spring. When the South Carolina fall to spring is, in fall, you are a proficient 3rd grader sitting in a 4th grade class, in theory. And at the end of that year, you were a proficient 4th grader getting ready to walk out of that 4th grade class. How is your growth points aligned to that?
So if you assume that proficiency in 3rd grade is set at the same difficulty level relatively as proficiency in 4th grade, then if a student grows at the average, they'll remain proficient.
What I'm asking is how do you know to tell us that 12 points matches what South Carolina believes is that proficiency? What does your entity do to correlate that?
Gotcha. Great question. So we do something called a linking study, where we take our scale and we take a whole pile of kids in South Carolina that we've gotten from all the districts, where lots and lots of districts in South Carolina use it. So we take all this data from all these different places, and then we look at, here was what they got on the state test, here's what they got on our test, and we line them up. And then we provide to you, if a student in third grade is at this score, 85-ish% likely that they're over the bar. And we do that back to fall
Okay,
as well.
that's what I was looking for.
Yep,
Okay.
so a teacher can start in the fall and have an idea, if I grow this kid as expected, as what we see across the country, by the spring,
Can they use
should be
MAP to
good.
say that if I look at your MAP score, I know that you are where South Carolina, which we all know students grow at different stages, so I'm not saying they should be there. But we know what South Carolina says a third grader sitting in a fourth grade class for the first day should know, in theory, because they're getting ready for a fourth grade SC ready. Does your MAP test tell that teacher the student is there, is ready to start the first day of fourth grade, aligned to the South Carolina standards? Does the MAP in the fall tell a teacher where they are in terms of ready to start the fourth grade on the first day of fourth grade?
It tells the teacher where each student in their class is, what they know.
In terms of
in
South
term-
Carolina standards of what what a
He said,
fourth grader would know on the first day?
he said it was like an 85th,
Right,
85% correlation to
Yeah.
SC standard.
Right, so I can tell you, like, a student walks in and they, and they test in the fall and you get a fall score on them, we can tell you with 85% confidence that they either are likely to be proficient or not, if throughout that year they learn what's typical,
thank you.
right? But you'll have a bunch of kids that walk in that are already a 5 on your state test, and you'll have a bunch of kids that walk in that are a 1 on your state test, and we tell you that too. Right? Because we measure precisely, and then we go from there.
Okay.
Okay? Okay, so now we're going to get into your data. How have I done so far? You guys okay? Yeah, got a thumbs up? Okay. All right, so we created this report called an Insights Report. Like a couple of us got in a room and started drawing up what would be useful information for a superintendent and a school board to give you sort of a high-level flyover of what's going on in your school system. It is supposed to be easily understandable. I hope it is that way. It represents both achievement and growth data, but remember that this is only MAP data, right? And so school performance is more than just MAP data. It's not, we're a good, robust data source. We think we're the best at what we do, but that doesn't mean that that's all that a school is. So schools need, more than just that. It provides a performance snapshot, but it doesn't tell you why something is the way it is, or it doesn't tell you what to do next. So as you're reading this, what I'm hoping is that you take this report as a place to springboard into deeper conversations with staff about potential things to celebrate, potential things to learn from, potential areas that you may want to dive in more deeply. But there's more under this than this. Does that make sense? Okay. So throughout the report, we're going to use language that says this is about average, right? The achievement of these kids is about average. The growth of these kids is about average. Or it's slightly above or moderately above. And in the report, it will give you this little key, but we use it consistently throughout the report to just put some numbers into sort of common language for people, right? These are based on just some standard statistical numbers. We can argue if you like them or not, but it's just a way we came up with to just be uniform for people when we do this. The report goes 2nd through 8th grade for you, and it's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 kids that were tested per grade in reading and in math. And so all those students will not necessarily be represented in the data because a lot of the data is about growth. And for growth, you need to have tested the kids both in the fall and the spring. So because of mobility or other reasons, right, kids may not have all of them, but that gives you a representative idea about how many kids per grade actually is represented in the data. So the first part of the report hits an executive summary, and I've just taken excerpts that I think have some interesting stuff for you in them. So the first part of the report in the executive summary is just one page, and it basically says that the achievement of your district is slightly above average, but growth is about average nationally. You can see that achievement is a little higher in reading than math, but growth is about the same for both of them. Overall, across the district.
Slightly above average for South Carolina?
No, this is national.
Okay.
Yep, all public schools across the country. This is typical for what happens.
Just so we can understand that.
Yep.
There, in reading, if you go to your achievement and growth, the 62 blue in achievement means what in reading?
In reading, it means that your kids here are reading better than 6 out of 10 kids.
At that point in time, in
Correct.
the country. So they're reading better than 6 out of 10 kids at the point in time of the test than the other children taking that same test throughout the country at the same point in time, roughly.
Yes, but it's even better than that. It's not the kids that took the test. It's public school kids across the country.
That's what I said, the kids that took the test
No,
across the country.
what I'm saying is we shape our data so that it's nationally representative and not just user representative.
Okay, so you can take this and say that even children not taking the MAP test, we still think you're doing better than 6 out of 10
That's correct.
of those.
This is based on about 4,000 kids, you said?
Hundreds of
No,
thousands
the
of kids.
the norms themselves are based on about 10 million kids.
I mean, no, your test results for CCSD.
Oh, yours? Yeah, it's about 4,000 kids per grade, right? So this is one number that rolls them all up between 2nd and 8th grade and says in reading, your 2nd and 8th graders all together are achieving better than 6 out of 10.
So 4,000 from each grade roughly, you're saying?
35 to 4, yep.
That doesn't count for that's an average of all, correct?
No.
The 62?
Yeah.
Yes, correct. It's an average of all of them.
But that doesn't break it down for the areas that theoretically score low though.
We're going to get into, this is just the first shot. The
Gotcha.
report dives deeper.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And similarly for the growth, right, at 53, 52, that means you're growing better than 5 out of 10, 50% of the country. The next one, if you were just like the country, you'd be like that far left bar, where you've got 25% of the kids in the bottom quartile, you've got 50% in the middle, and you got 25% at the top. Right? Does that make sense? The next bar over, district, says, okay, you've got 22% of your kids that are in the bottom quartile. So you've got slightly less low achieving kids than what's typical for the country. And you've got slightly more high achieving kids than what would be typical for the country. Okay, so those are the kids you serve in the district. The question then is, how do you do with them? And so then that gets us to growth. And so for your lowest achieving kids, you can see you're growing them at about the 46th percentile, so slightly less than typical. Where your highest achieving kids, you're growing at the 56th percentile, slightly better than typical. Does that make sense? I see pages flipping. I want to make sure you guys are on.
You lost me on one page.
25%, because that.
Page 5.
I didn't see
page?
I didn't see that
5.
other graphic page.
Yeah, but I see the other
Page
one.
5 in this one.
Oh, that's right, you got the inside. So I guess it'll help you if I just call out page numbers, right?
Yeah,
I
every
was-
now and then,
It's on our computer, too.
Okay,
every now and then.
okay, every now and then I'll do that.
So back up one.
Okay,
There's that.
What page
Yeah.
number is We only
that's
have
page
2
5,
bars.
top of page 5.
We only have
We
two
have 2
numbers. We're
bars.
trying to tell you that doesn't exist in our packet.
Yeah,
Right, so the 2 bars that are here are you for reading and math, so you have the right 2 bars.
Okay.
From a presentation standpoint, we added the other ones just to give it a little extra context.
Thank you.
So those are the kids you serve and how well they're doing in reading and math. This one tells you how they're growing at the bottom of page 5. One other thing to note that's sort of in the text there on page 5 is people are often concerned about their very lowest achieving kids, right? So, and your very highest achieving kids. So you've got about 14% of kids that are greater than the 90th percentile. So you'd expect 10, if you were like the country, you've got 14%. So you've got a good portion of very high achieving students. You're growing them at the 56th percentile. So still in that about average range, but topping out of the about average range. The bottom decile, you've got just about the same percentile as the country, right? There's 10% there, you've got 10%. You're growing those students at the 44th percentile. So working down towards the slightly less than average, but still in that about average range. The difference between the two of them is a slight difference, right? We would statistically classify it as a slight difference between the growth of your highest achieving and your lowest achieving kids. Okay, so now let's move on to schools. So now I just skipped to page 7. So what this does is it puts your schools as a dot, each school is a dot, and then pages 8, 9, beyond that go and list the individual schools. But it puts them on a dot where you've got achievement on the vertical axis and growth on the horizontal axis. So what you'd like is you'd like all your schools to be in that upper right-hand quadrant, right? You'd like all your schools to be high-achieving, high-growth schools. You don't want schools to be in the low-achievement, low-growth quadrant. The way you get to high-achievement, high-growth is you move them up in growth, and then once they're high growth for a while, then they can move up to high achievement. You'll notice that there are not a lot of schools in the high growth but low achievement box, and that's your goal. That's like the next step, is to get those schools moving over there. Do you have questions on this slide? One other little sidebar I want to say, just as a indication that there's a story behind the story. I told you I did that national study, right? And so I'm working on the next steps of it. And I just happened on my computer to have South Carolina data in math. So this morning, sitting in my hotel room, I just sort of opened it up and I ran the data. And I was looking for schools that were low achievement, but whose growth had been improving over years. Does that make sense? They may not be at that 50 yet, so they may not have crossed the threshold, but they're getting better. And as just an example, Northwoods Middle School, for instance, has had better growth every year for the past 5 years, right? Than they had before.
Yeah.
So they're growing better each year over themselves,
Correct.
and nationally normed, what are they doing?
They're not quite at the 50th percentile yet, but they were way far away from it before.
In 50 percentile, meaning 50% of the kids achieve better and 50% achieve
Correct.
less.
Right. And if you want kids' achievement to go up year after year, you've got to get them over the 50th percentile. right? If you get them at 50, they stay the same. So you want to get them over so that their achievement can go up. But you've got some stories underneath the data, right, is my point, right? That there's some stuff going on, so please ask your administrators some questions when you see things that are potentially of concern, right? So then the report goes through all the different schools and color codes them by which quadrant they're in. And in some cases, you'll see that they're just in a high growth quadrant for just one subject, right? But those dots are representing multiple subjects. So, you can go through the report and take a look at some of those schools. And if there are, schools that are of concern to you, then those are ones you might point out to staff, and then they can go begin doing a deeper dive into what's, been going on in those schools.
I have a question for you.
Sir?
So does the map data tell us the areas that students are struggling in, or in areas students are doing well in?
Yep.
Does it give us that?
Well, before I say yes too quickly, what do you mean by areas?
Well, math, the subject area.
Yes,
To
absolutely,
identify the strengths and weaknesses.
absolutely.
And so now, if we see growth on map data, say students had lots of growth, should we expect to see growth also on the report card, the growth in the classroom? How do the two equate?
It depends, right? You would hope that all those measures line up, but for instance, classroom grades are often impacted by more than just academics. But I don't know your grading system here. Sometimes people are on standards-based grading, sometimes they're not, right? But sometimes attendance factors into grades, or homework completion factors into grades, where what we're doing is doing an assessment of only their knowledge in reading or knowledge in math at a point in time. So, yeah, we hope that there's a correlation between all that, but that's also why I'm saying you should look at more than just one data point when you're trying to figure out what's going on with kids.
Just one last thing. So does a map show that where the student is grade level wise and where they're growing from that point, or just shows the growth in general?
So we'll measure a student and say, on our scale, this is students at 200.
Mm-hmm.
But then our norms can say that's average for third grade, or that kid's exceptional for third grade, right? So that's when I say we try to measure it really accurately, and then we have a number of different lenses you can overlay to say, yep, compared to the country, they're doing great. Compared to the state, they're going to be proficient. Compared to college readiness, they're on track for Harvard, right? Or they're on track for, any other four-year institution, right? So those are different overlays you can put over the data.
And this, before we get into schools, I promise this will probably be my last question, but you seem to have, I said probably, but you seem to have two monikers, high and low. So, I'm looking at something that's like 51% and labeled as high.
Right.
You don't do an upper echelon high and an average. You just do over 50% of the kids doing and less than 50% of the kids doing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, in that quadrant report, right?
I'm specifically looking at the outliers. I mean, you've got one
Yeah.
listed as high achieving, and it's at 51. So you just simply say anybody more than half is high.
Yeah, so the way the colors got there with the different schools was we tried to find the ones that were furthest away from the middle in a quadrant, simply to say maybe that's a school you can learn from, right? We played with how we could color code this to say, well, all these schools are really about average, right?
Yeah, I'm back
But-
one page where you have the outliers.
Yeah, you're on page 7?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm like 51 is a high and 49
Correct.
is a low.
Correct, because you can see they don't go very far into that low achievement, high growth quadrant, so we picked up the ones that were there.
Okay, thank you.
So if you flip a couple more pages to 11, this is about proficiency on the SC Ready and how we project proficiency. The little dash is what we would expect based on where the bar is set in South Carolina. And then the standpipe the yellow or green color is how we say you will do as a district overall in that grade and that subject. So you can see a couple of things. One is that where the standard is set by the grade is not consistent in your state, and it isn't in any state. It varies by grade level. But overall, in general, your performance would say that you've got more kids being proficient than what we would expect based on where that bar is set. Longitudinally, on page 12, 3 years of data says growth is about the same across grades and subjects. 50th percentile, 52nd percentile in 18-19, so not a significant change. So growth is pretty steady for the district as a whole. Excuse me. And then when you get to page 14, now we're starting to break things down lower, Mr. Hollinshead, like you asked about, are we getting down to how are we doing by grade, for instance, right? So you can see by grade, reading is fairly constant at 50th percentile or higher, typically, where math isn't, particularly in some of the lower grades. And so, if you want to improve achievement of kids that are in the lower grades, you've got to get that growth number up at least at the 50th percentile or higher.
Why is that the mark, 50%? Why is that the mark?
Because if you're average, if you're less than average, your achievement will go down relative to everybody else over time.
So why is it 70% average?
No, average is just average. It's just what's typical for the country.
Average isn't it's not a determination, it's
I know, but what you're saying, though, you say like half across the country, so you're saying half the students, like 50% or so, and I think you said we were like 51, 52%. So you're saying half. When you average them for grades and academics, it's usually more than half the students. Usually a lot higher than that. In other words, you're saying 1 out of 2 students, basically what you're basically saying, 1 out of 2 students.
Right. So I guess what I'm getting at is, so if I'm trying to move how much kids know relative to their peers, right? If a kid learns just the average amount in a year, they'll stay even with their peers. Does that make sense?
I hear you.
Okay. So if they learn a little bit more than average than their peers, their achievement relative to everybody else will go up a little bit. If they learn a little bit less than their peers, their achievement will go down a little bit compared to everybody else. So if you're trying to make achievement go up, the first thing you have to do is get growth higher than average. And so if average is, you can use different words, typical, 50th percentile, all means the same thing. So if you want to get growth up, or achievement up, growth has got to be up first.
What about kids that already are excelling, kids that are already doing 95%, top performing kids?
Yep.
When you measure their results, if they're already making A+ student, how much growth do you expect to have from the fall to the spring? Or would there be very little growth if they're already to the top?
Great question. So you would expect where a kid that's in the middle might make 6-8 points growth, a kid that's at the top might only make 2 points growth, right? However, we take into account where the kid starts. When we say, how well has this kid done compared to their peers? So when we say, you know what, your top performing kids are growing at the 70th percentile, that means that your top performing kids are growing better than 7 out of 10, which is great. They may only be moving 2 points, but it's still better than 7 out of 10. Yeah. So our norms take into account whether they're high achieving, low achieving, middle achieving, and so it puts everybody on a fair playing field when you're evaluating the growth.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last one that I wanted to just talk about is on page 16, which is the different ethnicity groups and growth. And you can take a look at the top row there, which is the achievement of students across your district and growth of your students across the district. And your Asian and Caucasian students are both the highest achieving and the highest growing students. And your Hispanic African American students are your lowest achieving, with your African American students being your lowest growing students. So that was all the highlights I had from the report. Are there any questions? Are there any other things that Dr. Tarasawa and I can answer for you?
The page we're on now, do you have any pointers that contribute to the numbers? Or especially to the low growth of Hispanic and African American children? And you think that contributes to those contributes to that percentage?
So I want to give you a two-part answer. Part one answer is we don't know, because we don't know your context. There's lots of research out there about what is the most effective practices, and I'm sure that your superintendent and staff are well versed in those and are doing their utmost to help those students grow. We don't know Charleston context. I don't know your school, so it's very difficult for me to make any comment on that. The other part of my answer, though, is we have in our research department just initiated things, something we call school research partnerships. And we have had one established for about 3 years with the Santa Ana School District in California. And we've done some work with them on like early warning indicators. So if a student is disengaged from our test, if they're just rapidly guessing the answers, that's a sign that their attendance may be a problem, that their discipline may be a problem, and that their academic engagement may be a problem. So it's a little early warning system. Well, that research partnership has gone so well that we have now this year expanded it to Elgin School District, which is the second largest district in Illinois. They have 50% of their incoming kindergartners have English language learners, and they have an amazing dual language program. So we're going to help them evaluate that. The other thing is we had a phone call not too long ago with your staff and said we would love to engage with you in a research partnership as well.
Yes.
So we would bring our research staff to bear to help you answer important questions for you, so that you can make changes and understand what's working and what isn't, and dive into some of those things as best as we can help you. And then the things we learn, we would like to share nationally as well. So hopefully that is it's just part of our mission to go do that sort of work. So we would love it if you guys would join us in that effort, and let us just provide some of our research resources to help you.
I would love.
Okay, go ahead.
I would love that. I love research. Anyways, not that the achievement gap is acceptable, because it's not. Is this sort of what national achievement gap looks like? I mean, this kind of disparity?
Yes.
So it's I already knew this,
Well,
but it's a national problem.
Yeah, I'll say one thing, and then Beth is really the expert in it. The achievement gap is achievement gap.
Yes.
There is not, with the districts I work with, there is not necessarily a growth gap.
Right, which I'm glad that a lot of this discussion was about that.
Yeah, I think it's really important when we're thinking about school boards and district administration, you have multiple data points to look at. So a lot of emphasis, especially in the media, state level, is on proficiency, and that is a very real consequence, and we know can predict longer-term outcomes. But if you're trying to catch kids up, so we think about that quadrant report, you're serving those kids that are coming in diversity of different levels of income, different levels of resources or pre-K. So it's not so much where the kids are coming in from, it's how you're moving those kids. So we want to see high growth in all kids. And so the question about talented and gifted or elite, you can answer those kinds of questions here. And in Charleston, it looks like you're doing a relatively great job with your highest achieving kids. That's not the case in a lot of places. It also looks like some of the kids that are coming in with the most adversity are continuing to struggle. And so when you make resource decisions or programmatic, having multiple indicators, so not just the state proficiency, because that will, some of those outliers, you're missing what's going on, and you may be missing some really important learnings in those schools that are making great gains for kids. They're maybe not quite proficient yet, but if we don't look at multiple measures, you're not going to get under the hood of what's really going on. And so part of this presentation, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things and work alongside, is to understand more what's going on, to scale lessons that are being learned.
Thank you.
Well, the high achieving schools have always been achieving high in this district for many years. The problem is the low-end schools have always struggled either with resources or opportunities. So that's kind of like a double-edged sword statement there.
Charleston's not unique in this pattern. I think what could be unique is what are we doing to get growth on the lower end, right? So what are we doing? Where are we scaling? And Charleston, of any place, has the diversity and heterogeneity to be able to answer the questions. A lot of districts don't have that. They're serving entirely urban centers, high levels of poverty, or are nested with really elite suburban schools. Charleston serves all of these, right? So you can answer with greater specificity what you're doing right in certain places.
Okay, we'll allow Mr. Frazier and then Mr. Garrett to ask a question.
Yeah, just a quick question, and I apologize for arriving late. On the last slide that we're referring to right now, are these comparative to national averages? So these achievement levels and growth levels are against national averages for everyone? Or are we saying in the case of Hispanic and African American, they're performing lower than their peers nationally? Which is it? It's
the national average for all students. We have knocked around, it's too flip. We have had serious internal discussions whether we should produce achievement and growth norms by ethnicity, and we have, as an organization, decided not to do that. We want all students to be shown on a level playing field, because we don't know why African American students aren't growing as well as the national pattern, and if we produced norms that showed that African American students weren't achieving or growing as well as white students, that may lower the expectations for those students, because people would say, oh, well, we're growing at the 60th percentile for African American students. That's great when it's really not compared to all kids.
I guess maybe I'll ask it a different way, because I understand and appreciate that context. But it would be nice to know if somebody was doing better than we are, or if we're doing better than somebody else, can we learn from them? So if it's disaggregated, it might help in that regard.
Right, so you can do it just based on that number, right? You can just look for people that are growing better than the 42nd percentile for African American students.
And come to our own conclusions.
And come to, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Fair.
Mr. Garrett?
My only question was, and this is, thank y'all very much for being here. With respect to what would y'all be and let me finish the question first. What would y'all be adding that a teacher would not be able to sit down with their MAP scores if they know what they're looking at and say, all right, I got to get, student A and B to here by the end of the year? Like, we've been doing this for 3 years, and some of these schools are small enough, and by grade, you can look and say, that's one teacher right here. What's going on here? I feel like unless we do our part on with a principal and teacher relationship, what else would y'all add beyond that?
So
I give you the opportunity because the question's in my mind. I appreciate you and value very much what you do, and I'm very much in favor of doing more research. I'm just asking this for myself so that I appreciate it.
Yeah, to me, the closer you can make change to the student, the more impact you're going to have, right? And for instance, Chicago, that we talked about at the very beginning, that's doing so well, their theory of action is principles. It's all about principals, getting the right principals, supporting principals, having the right kind of leadership. That's their theory of action, and they've been on that train for a very long time. So my experience with school boards is, your role is governance and oversight, right? Your role is setting strategy, setting budget, so if administration comes, administration goes, you're the ones that keep the district on track, on course for whatever your theory of change is. So I think it's important for you all to understand what it is that you believe is going to, in your specific context, with your specific history, going to make a difference for your kids, right? Get very clear about that and then go work towards implementing that with focus and dedication, and I know all those things that, you and staff already have towards it. Does that did I help you at all?
Oh, no.
Okay, sorry.
With the,
I tried.
I guess what additionally, besides, digging into which, we get when we pay
Right.
for, when we do the MAP testing, what additionally have you come in and done for the districts at Elgin and Santa Ana?
Oh, from a research perspective, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, so Elgin is just starting, but they're like, we have a dual language program. We think we're doing it well, but we're not sure. So can you evaluate our program, tell us the strengths and weaknesses so we can change our program to do better?
Okay,
Right.
got it, makes sense.
Santa Ana, we want some early warning indicators for our kids. We know which kids to focus conversations on more quickly. Can you help us figure that out? We're working with them now on, they have kids that are enrolled in dual courses, so they're enrolled in a high school class and a college class at the same time. And they want to know, are the outcomes for those kids better in college than if kids don't enroll in the college classes?
Got it.
When you do that research, do you do it for that district, or are you again trying to nationally norm that? I mean, I'm not sure how many Elgin school districts you're going to find out there to nationally norm. Are you doing a good job with your dual language education? So does your research shift when it comes into something like that, or are you literally comparing that to other districts with the same demographics doing dual language education?
Right now, we would focus on you and your programs and your performance, bringing all the tools that we have to that. And then the conclusions, we hope, would be solid enough to generalize for the population to say, we've learned this about dual language programs in Elgin, and we've tweaked this and that, but here are some lessons about how to take care of English language learner students more broadly.
I would add just another comment to Mr. Garrett's component, and that's also what are we doing kind of beyond the research in particular districts. And I would say one of the issues with data is that often they're done to teachers. So how do you get teachers to be empowered, right? So and I'm a parent where my kid's taking math, so it's been this really interesting ride lately, where I go in and I see my son who's performing okay in math, but really struggling in reading, and now I get some sub-scores of what I may be able to do to help during the summertime or after school or Lexile to get what kind of books.
I've been through the same
Yeah.
thing.
So that's down, like, how do we trickle down essentially empowering data? So often it's punitive. So often we're going out and changing leaderships based on these measures. So how can we think about changing the culture in the school and in a district to really buy in, where parents are getting reports and they're having conversations with their teachers. Teachers have professional learning opportunities to come together and problem solve and not be defensive about their data. How do we roll that up at the building level with strong principal leadership and oversight as in the Chicago model? And so we've seen this all equipped with, professional learning and development and opportunities to do that. And I'll let you speak to Allison more about that. But there are things besides the research. The data is actually not the really interesting part. The question is, what are we doing in our buildings to drive change? And I think that's a meatier topic, if you will.
Yeah, for me, the data just provides a window into what's happening, right? And it's that window that then requires a response. When you look through it and you see it, what are you going to do, right? And that's really what MAP does, is it provides a phenomenal window into what's happening, but then it's up to you to figure out, okay, now what do we do? What do we celebrate? What things are going great? What things do we need to move on and learn from?
Okay, are there any further questions for our
Wait,
Mr. Holland?
Are there any other organizations like yours that do what you do?
You're going to get a biased response.
So the reason why I'm asking is because, you know, sometimes we get caught for soul sourcing. So, I mean, I would think we would have to be fair, me, and to know who else does what you do to compare apples to oranges.
Well, also, to be fair, the state mandates which vendors we can use as well. So we
Yes.
can only compare to the ones we're allowed to use.
So the answer is yes, there are competitors. When people put out RFPs, there will be other people that bid. But I left a 20-year career in nuclear power and a 6-year career in public education to come to NWA 9 years ago because I think we're the best at what we do,
Well said.
right? And we're the only ones that have research like this, right? It's a huge differentiator. We're a nonprofit. We're mission-driven. It's why we make phone calls and say, how can we help you? Right? So,
Is there a website?
yes, sir, nwa.org.
Any further questions? Again, thank you so much for presenting to us today and filling out our questions. We really do appreciate the data that you have shared with us today, and I'm sure it's been helpful to every board member. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Is there any questions for, I'm sorry. She's providing more. Okay. All right.
Going to review more detailed information about each school.
Like this stuff, okay, good.
All right.
The level leaders are going to approach the table too.
I'm sorry, say again?
Okay. The level leaders are going to join me now. We are going to start the second part of our workshop, if that's okay?
All right.
So are we to assume the second part is when you start delving into the district's map data? And
And SC Ready, it's the additional information that's here on each school that the board asked for.
So I have one question, though, before we go school to school, because when you look at the achievement and growth percentile on that page,
On which page?
on the page 16, and you go from left to right, you're going from the higher achieving to the lower achieving. The other thing that strikes you as you go from left to right is you go from the less transient to more transient populations. So we send this data up to be analyzed, and it comes back, but I'm struggling with, does it follow the child, or are these school generalizations? Because a lot of kids that take MAP in the fall take it at one elementary school, and they take MAP in the spring at another elementary school. Does that data follow that child, and how do we get a clear picture of, are we looking at schools that don't grow, or are we looking at children that don't grow?
Right. The data would typically follow the student if that student's within our system. So those scores don't go away. They stay in that student's profile.
They stay in that student's protocol, but you give us school reports.
Yeah,
So how does that, how do you carry that? That a kid took the MAP and it's because it seems to be that as we get to the lower performing, we're getting to the more transient. It's more critical to know, is this child growing? And if they started the year at Pepper Hill and they ended the year at North Charleston Elementary School, who's got the RIT score?
The report would go with wherever the student is at the time of that report. You are correct. Okay.
Okay, are you ready to present?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Okay, so good afternoon. During this part of the workshop, we'll have an opportunity to walk through our SE Ready data, results for elementary and middle, and we'll also look at our end-of-course examination results for high schools. The data that we'll share today will be broken down by ethnicity or race for each school at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. And you'll see that some schools that are listed have no bar on some of the graphs because the population for that specific subgroup or subpopulation would be too small to display. The information in this presentation is based on one assessment for a specific subject and grade level. For this reason, it would be difficult to make some generalized conclusions about a school as a whole, but we can provide a summary of what those patterns and trends look like. Okay? Okay, so what you see on the screen and in the handout that we provided are the results for the subpopulation of white students and their performance on SC Ready ELA for grades 3 through 5 across the district. The blue represents the percent of students not meeting grade level expectations as of spring of last year. And the lightest green on the graph indicates those students that are approaching those grade level expectations. And then the medium and dark green represent students meeting and exceeding the grade level expectations. Again, if you see a school listed and there's nothing there, no bar, that means that that population was not large enough to display. Okay. Okay, so the results you see here are the subpopulation for Hispanic students for SC Ready ELA, same grade level, grades 3 through 5. And we'll walk through these.
Confused on the chart,
I'm sorry?
the chart, I want to understand it better. You said the blue does not meet, right?
Not me.
That's right. The blue represents not meeting the grade level expectation. And then that light green, the very lightest green, is they're approaching grade level. And then the medium green means that they're meeting. And then that darkest green would mean that they're exceeding. And so you can look across and see kind of where those colors fall.
So my question is this, for example, AC Cochran, for example,
Or Hispanic.
the part in blue, those are the students that are not meeting.
Those
Hispanic.
are white students at AC Cochran not meeting.
Hispanic.
This one's Hispanic.
And the second page
Right.
will be the Hispanic
All
at
right,
AC
but that,
Cochran.
either one, just what I'm to understand, the blue is not meeting, right?
Yes,
Now-
sir.
Now, in the same row, I go up to the lighter green and find a percentage that is meeting,
Right.
Yes,
and then the
sir.
darker green. So if they read it right, so 10%, well, about 10% of AC Cochran are exceeding,
Yes, sir.
and
In the
then,
Hispanic population.
and so 20, I guess 22%, 25%, the
Meeting.
meets,
Right.
Yes,
all
sir.
right, in the blue, okay. I just want to understand, okay.
Yes, sir.
See all in one row, okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I guess, what is approaches?
Um,
At the end of the fifth grade, you're taking SC Ready in the fifth grade, and you're approaching what? That when you enter the fifth grade next year, you'll not quite be a fifth grader, but approaching being I'm trying to see where that fits in, because they take it at the end of the year. You're measuring their ability to go next year. They're meeting it or they're not meeting it. What's this approaching do?
So that approaching category signals that at the conclusion of your fourth grade year, you are approaching grade level standards in terms of proficiency and mastery.
And so that means you're not meeting grade level standards, so you're going to go into the next school year not on grade level. So why do you differentiate not meets and approaching? Why,
So this is the state framework so it allows us to serve students based on needs. So there's a group of students who did not meet, and then there's a group of students who are approaching, a group who did meet, and then a group who exceeded. So we can differentiate and support their learning based on those categories and in relationship to other indicators.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Very well said.
Yes, Ms. Allen.
Going to page number 3, SU Ready for African-American males, African-American students, I'm sorry.
Right.
You're fine.
Now, just to give a quick example, here where Shakur is, and the light blue that does not meet, so that is saying 70% of the students are not meeting? Okay,
Yeah.
so let's move up. Where that, the green, let me finish my question, please. So where that green is above that says exceed, that's what, 10% that is, exceeding, correct?
A little
I
less.
think it's 0 exceeding and 10% are meeting.
Hang on, y'all,
5%.
let me ask my question, please. Thank you. Thank you, dear. Let's go back to this. So, in the light green shaded area, that says that approaching, what percentage of that is?
It looks like less than 10.
Okay, cool. So then, let's move over next to Charleston, and I'm done, Reverend Mack. Charleston Progressive, you got what, 30% that's not meeting, and then you have a higher pattern of either meeting
Approaching.
and exceeding, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's why I'm reading it now. Thank you.
Okay, continue on, please.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Already talked about that, and we'll move on. This next graph, actually, sorry. This next graph actually shows SE Ready Math for white students in grades 3 through 5. Okay. And then the next illustrates the percentage of students scoring, or Hispanic students scoring on SE Ready Math for grades 3 through 5. And then this graph actually shows the subpopulation for Black or African American students and their performance on SE Ready Math for grades 3 through 5. In general, for SE Ready ELA and Math in elementary school, the percentage of Black or African American students and Hispanic students scoring meets or exceeds is lower than that of white students. The gap between white and Black student performance is almost identical in ELA and Math. And the gap between white and Hispanic student performance was slightly larger in ELA when compared with Math. So those are our generalizations or our conclusions of patterns or trends that we see in the data for elementary.
Mr. Holland said that's about the score a minute ago. And so I look at the chart, then I look on my computer. So if I'm reading that right, for score, for example, it looks like the light green to the top.
Right.
The last 6% maybe.
Which one are you referencing to?
There's
Math or-
right, there is somewhere around 6 to 5% for exceeds.
Ma'am?
That's correct, for exceeds, about
Yeah,
that.
so what I'm saying, so there none of the children that you cohort exceed?
See, right.
No, there are some at the very top. If you look in that dark,
Okay, 1%.
So that looks like, okay, like I said, so maybe 1% and 5% meets.
Approaches.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I mean, approaches, I'm sorry.
meets
That's
and
approaches.
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 He's right.
Meets is correct.
We're right, Reverend
right.
Collins, 5% meet, 1% exceed. The remainder of them are below meets or exceeds.
That's correct.
I guess the other gap is kind of, okay, I see that's the approaches, okay. But then you got the approaches, okay, I see. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So these tests are administered 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade.
That's correct.
I think it would help to see 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade results instead of lumping together. Specifically, you've got one school in here that didn't have 5th grade when you gave this. So it's clearly not apples to apples.
Reflective, yeah.
We can certainly show you the grade levels, and we actually have a tool that can help with doing some of that really pretty much any way you want. And I'll talk to you about that too at the end, if that's okay.
Question, if I could. We don't have any combined results, right? So you've disaggregated all of the results. Is there a total page for each school?
The total pages for each school as far as like no, not on this.
Yeah,
No,
because I
sir.
think one of the challenges you face here is, for instance, whether it's white students or African-American students, is that a population of 5, 50, or 500? So
Right.
this graph isn't, with all due respect, is not as helpful in telling me where we stand, because if 3 white students are at Mary Ford and they're all doing well, that looks great on paper, but that's 3 people, it's not 300. So I think we have to
You're right.
look at the combined
Yeah,
results to see how our
understand.
schools are actually
Right.
doing.
And then you've got schools on here that don't go to the 5th grade.
Right.
And so it doesn't match.
That makes
because-
sense?
It is.
Okay, thank you.
But that's something you could provide to give us totals. You could post that for us. That'd be great.
Absolutely.
And as we continue on, and I know there's a lot of questions and concerns as we begin to see these data in the chart and graph, the way it looks. So everyone gets excited about them, and as we go along, so we'll have to tweak it a little bit so we can kind of get the defined numbers that we're looking at. So that's what we're saying. But what I would ask board members to do, though, is if you could just jot down your questions so we can get through these slides and then go back and be able to address whatever concerns there may be. Okay? All right.
Okay, so now we'll focus on middle schools. We have the same representations in the color scheme that we showed you before. Remember, the blue represents the students not meeting those grade level expectations. The lightest green would indicate those students are approaching, and medium and dark represent meeting and exceeds. This first graph shows you the percent of white students for ELA for middle school grades on SE Ready. The next graph shows you Hispanic for ELA for middle grades.
Yeah, you're right.
And then this graph actually shows you the Black or African American students and their performance on SE Ready ELA for middle grades. And we'll also look at math. This first graph shows you the subpopulation of white students and their performance on SE Ready Math for grades 6 through 8. And Hispanic students, again, SE Ready Math. And this last one for middle grades shows you Black or African American students and their performance on SE Ready Math. In general, for middle schools, for SE Ready ELA and Math, we see the same trends that we saw in grades 3 through 5. The percentage of Black or African American students and Hispanic students scoring meets and exceeds is lower than that of white students. The gap between white and Black or African American student performance is almost identical in ELA and Math. And the gap between white and Hispanic student performance is slightly larger in ELA compared with Math. So we see the exact same trends.
Matt, if you don't, you said wait, right? All right.
Okay.
Okay, that's better.
All right, so now we'll shift to high school performance for the end of course assessments. This works similarly as far as the color combinations. The blue represents the percentage of students earning an F or failing to pass the assessment for EOC. In this case, it would, or end of course exam. In this case, it would be English 1. The lightest green on the graph indicates students who earned a D on this particular assessment, which is considered passing. The dark green represents students earning a C or higher on this particular assessment, which is considered above the expectation of passing. This first graph is for white students. And then the next is for Hispanic, again for English 1, end of course examination. And the next graph will show you the subpopulation for Black or African American students and their performance on English 1 EOC, or end of course assessment. And then we are also showing you Algebra 1 results. Again, the first graph for white students and their performance on Algebra 1. The next is for Hispanic. And remember, once the bars are missing, there was not, the population was not there to be able to provide that. And then the last one for Algebra 1 for Black and African American students. You can see the performance there. Biology 1 for white students. Biology 1 for Hispanic. And biology for Black or African American students and their performance on Biology 1 for EOC, or in the end of course assessment. The last end of course assessment that we'll talk about is the U.S. History and Constitution assessment. This first graph represents white students and their performance. The next, Hispanic students. And finally, Black and African American student performance. In summary, for high school, for grades 9 through 12 in general, for EOCs at the high school level, we again see the same kinds of trends that we saw in grades 3 through 5 and 6 through 8 for SE Ready. The percentage of Black or African American students and Hispanic students scoring C or higher, which in this case would be considered the expectation, is lower than that of their white counterparts. We also see the gap between white and Black student performance is similar across English 1, Algebra 1, Biology 1, as well as U.S. history results. Okay, so some overall patterns and trends. We do acknowledge, we do know that there is a readiness gap that exists between Black and African American students and Hispanic students and white students. We know that the gap exists for both ELA and math, and that for Hispanic students is slightly larger for ELA. I don't think that those are any surprises in what we've seen in our data. Some strategies that we are employing to address this. We're implementing strong supports for children and families through our early childhood and parenting programs. We're providing interventions for students who are not on track for college and career readiness. We're implementing a guaranteed and viable curriculum, and we're continuing to work through that process with professional development. We're creating clear college and career-ready pathways for students throughout our system. We're building a high qualified teacher workforce through strong professional development opportunities, and we're collaborating with higher education institutions to do so. We're redesigning supports for teachers so that we can be sure that they're receiving the resources they need, such as planning time and tools and materials, and again, professional development. We're also aligning school curriculum to ensure that all students, PK through 12, exit with the skills that are identified by local businesses and industry, such as those of the Charleston Metro Chamber's common skills in high demand, like communication and creativity and being on time. We're establishing that talent development pipeline that grows leaders at all levels, and we're investing in those opportunities for our leaders. And one last thing I wanted to share with you. I wanted to take this opportunity to share highlight some of the other resources that we have for accessing some summarized data. I think this can be really helpful. The Assessment Evaluation Department has launched the CCSD Public Interactive Data Center. This allows you to filter information and customize your graphs and tables by many different filters, by grade level, by ethnicity, by a specific school. There are lots and lots of ways that you can filter this data. And in your materials, you do have a link to this site. It's easily accessible also on our website. The department's also currently working on assembling the school dashboards for you that we'll provide in the next week or so as a board update. We'll make sure that we have those bound copies for you. You also have in your packet 2 other resources. You have a Schools Like Us handout. That report is for elementary, middle, and high. It provides some summarized report card ratings and information by similar poverty levels. You'll see achievement, growth, and overall ratings highlighted for your elementary and middle schools, and then achievement, college and career readiness, graduation rate, and overall ratings for our high schools. In addition, you do have the report card ratings overall summary handout also in your packet. This provides you with an at-a-glance summary of overall report card ratings for elementary, middle, and high. All of these resources and summarized data reports that we've shared today are intended to provide you with the information that you requested at our last meeting. I hope that this is helpful. I do hear that there are some other things that you would like, and we can certainly help you with that as well.
Okay, we'll go in order as asking questions. Let me start to my left first. Is there any questions?
Just follow up on the earlier comment, which is some combination of things. because I think it would be instructive if we're able to see where a school, you've got all the different subgroups, but then if we know the population of the subgroup and that school might be doing better than another one, and maybe there's something to be learned. So I think if we could just get that data in a simple form, that'd be helpful. Thank you. Well done.
Do you have the data from, I'm sure you do, from 2018?
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe even already accessible to us, but I'd like to see that along with the strategies that you recommended that you would employ for 2018.
Okay. Thank you.
No questions. Okay, so I have a silly question. I think I know the answer. But on the academic achievement ratings for schools like us, the BC, is that Berkeley County schools? And,
Dorchester 2 and so on.
okay, I just looking at.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
And
It is.
did y'all just put them in there? I only see BCs, but
It's some later in there.
like oh, I see. And did y'all just put them in there so we could compare with other schools in the other counties?
They're provided as a comparison point based on poverty levels so that you could see.
Okay, great. I agree with the points that Chris and Joyce have made, or questions, and great work. It's great information.
Reverend Collins?
Thank you. Get back to my page.
All right, you want me to come back to you?
I got it. There's C-ready math for 6th to 8th grade black students. Daniel Jenkins, for example, which is all blue and not even light green or light blue anywhere in the page. How many students are Daniel Jenkins?
Daniel Jenkins doesn't have 6th grade.
But that's what he's
You used to have it though. Last year.
They have Daniel Jenkins.
Daniel Jenkins.
Okay, guys, please allow our presenters to answer the questions. Ms. Coker?
Daniel Jenkins has a small number of overaged 8th graders that we serve in that building but due to their age not being appropriate to be in a middle school.
Students roughly how many?
Last year, it was about 8.
So these numbers here reflecting the last year's students?
Yeah, this is last year's data.
And what about the data for this year?
There are no 8th graders there currently.
Ma'am?
There are no 8th graders at Daniel Jenkins currently.
Do you have the high school, have Daniel Jenkins at the high school?
High school, yes, sir.
Do we have that data on here?
They would be included in the counts for each end-of-course exam if they had a specific number of students.
So is Daniel Jenkins on here, the high school is on here?
So you'll get the assessment results at the conclusion of this year. If you're looking for
This is last
SC ready, this will be
Right,
at the
this was this
conclusion of
past
the year.
year.
Daniel Jenkins is not in high school.
Okay, so, all right, so you don't have it this year.
Their
But-
scores report back to their home schools.
So you had about 8.
Wait, did you hear that, Reverend Collins? Say that again, Ms. Coker?
The Daniel Jenkins High School students, all Daniel Jenkins and Liberty Hill students, their scores report back to their home schools. So for the 8th graders, because they were in Daniel Jenkins, their scores were pulled out because they were housed there and not in a typical middle school setting. But all the other students in alternative programs, their scores report with their home school scores.
Well, how do we evaluate the program then at Daniel Jenkins or Liberty Hill or anywhere else if we don't have the scores?
So the students are transient, and so they come and go throughout the year. So typically, we look at students who are there prior to the 45th day, and our assessment office can pull the data for those students for us so that we can see the scores for the students who we've had a majority of the year.
I mean, as a school board member, how do I look and see the data? If I want to know how Daniel Jenkins is doing or how Liberty Hill is doing, how do I find the data myself? Would I have to trace each student back to his home school one at a time and come back and compile all the data? How do I learn how the program's doing?
So that's one of the challenges with the setup of alternative schools through the state is that they're still connected to their home schools. So there is no state report card for those programs. All of their scores go back. So we would have to pull that data internally.
Well, can't you pull the data yourself and compile it for your school, for Daniel Jenkins or Liberty
Yes,
Hill?
our assessment office can compile it.
I'd like to see that because not only must it be a discipline school, it has to be academic school also that's working, producing some results. Otherwise, we're just babysitting, and we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
They can pull
Derek?
the data.
I'm sorry.
There was one more. Simmons Pinckney. How many students are at Simmons Pinckney, roughly?
200.
You mean overall?
Yes.
About 200.
Well, 6th to 8th grade, yeah.
About 230.
230? So according to this now, you have about 1 or 2%, maybe 1% that's seeds, African Americans that are seeds, and maybe 5% that maybe 5% that's meats.
That's about right. Sounds about right.
You know, I get a little disturbed when I see this kind of data, for not just African Americans, but for any children, that we have a school where most of the children are academically deficient, and we in the school and we allow the school to continue on all year long without getting there and making the true changes that got to be made. And something got to be done different than what we're doing to make some gains. If it means putting 3 teachers in one classroom, you know, or having 6 assistants, whatever it takes, we got to make some gains somewhere. We can't. This is not acceptable. We got to do better. I'm not fussing at you.
I know.
You just getting my ear full, but.
Okay, Mr. Garrett?
Just a question with respect to, like, not getting to using scores against teachers, like Dr. Beth was mentioning, but as we have our parent-teacher conferences next week, are teachers ready and up to speed for explaining to parents where they're behind and need to, what they can do to help their child grow if they're behind or what?
Yes, sir, they are.
Okay.
We actually discussed that at our last principals meeting with our principals and our coaches from those buildings, and so they've been, briefed on how that should occur. And we have a folder full of resources for teachers to utilize, along with videos that show them how to conduct those conferences.
Okay. All right.
Okay, Ms. Coates?
So, and this is excellent information, but I think what Joyce and Mr. Frazier and Reverend Collins are trying to say is we're being asked to make some very specific, shattering shifts in our educational decisions. And in theory, you have maps, so you can track how the students are growing. So you take that data and tell us where the students are being successful and where they're not, or in some form of that turns into growth and achievement again, but it needs to follow the student because we're making decisions about how to group or ungroup or move or alter students' education. And unfortunately, this is great summary data for a school, but it's not helping us with the decisions we're going to get asked to make in the next 30 days. And so we need to see, just like Chris said, Reverend Collins mentioned the African American students at Simmons Pinckney. Well, good news, Reverend Collins. Every single non-African American student, every single one is failing. And we don't know if that's one student, and certainly when you have statistically doesn't work, well, we still have to make these decisions. So we need some help as a board that shows us the true data of why we should shift how we're educating kids. We know we have to. And we know we should, but we need something that tells us what to shift it to. And right now, we just know that there are certain schools in which the majority of the children are not learning, and it could be 10 kids or 100 kids. We need more specific data if you're going to ask us to make radical changes to how we improve this.
Mr. Hollinger?
No, I'm just going to study this. I'm good. Whatever I need. Thank you.
So it's definitely clear that that we need a deeper dive into the numbers as to where we stand academically with the different makeup of the races. I'll be perfectly honest with you, and you're just the presenters, right? I leaned over to the superintendent and I said to her, this report sickens my stomach.
Mine too.
To the point of the fact that we have to aggressively find a way to attack this achievement gap that has been lingering for 50-plus years. Just didn't happen overnight, right? So we've been kicking this can down the road for some time, trying to figure out what it is that we need to do to make these changes. The burden is placed on this board as we sit here, as this data is presented to us and given to us as to where we are and moving students and closing this gap. I concur that it's important that we have a deeper dive into the numbers as to where, and I believe I said this at the last meeting, to specifically where the issue lies within the school, to zero it down to the bare bone so that we can capture those students now. We will continue to see the numbers that we see now at the high school if we don't capture them at the elementary school. So we're going to be making some real bold changes here real soon, but it's very important that we do know that where the numbers currently lie, that these changes that we're going to be making is going to have a greater impact in closing where the gap is, to making sure that we have the adequate resources that we need within the various schools. And if we're going to be successful in doing that and really see the growth and really see the measure, then we have to make sure that we have just all of the, not saying that the information is not accurate, but a more deeper dive into the numbers so that we can say why we're doing A and B and why we're making this type of decision. When I said decision, I'm talking about the board. So with more data, we're able to be more successful in this measure. I do have to say that we're going to, board I'm speaking to now, that we're really going to have to look at ways of trying to not only reach the lowest performing students, but also make that in these decisions that we're making, that we're also making sure that this train for more higher achieving students also being challenged even deeper into these decisions. So this is where we are, and these are some of the changes that we're going to have to make, and we're going to rely on you to make sure that we have the data necessary to make those decisions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For presenting.
President?
I'm sorry.
Thank you for your work. I agree that we have to do something, and I also know that there's been some proposals made by the superintendent of things we can do, and they're bold changes, and we've been receiving a lot of pushback from certain members of the community not to make the changes. And I hope that this information gives all of us the backbone to do the changes that we need, because we have 50,000 kids that we need to think about, and we get people coming up talking about 10 kids or 100 kids. And so I hope, to me, this is enough information. We have to start doing some of these recommendations.
I agree, but if we're going to talk
And
about
we have to just be strong and bold about doing it,
if
because
we're going to do it, we cannot talk about high achieving students as C or better. We got to know what high achieving is versus medium achieving. We need better data.
okay, that's
All right. Just 1 second.
And I guess that brings me to the question I have, and you may not have an answer for it, but as educators, when you got this data, how can you relate what this data means to some of the recommendations that are on the table? Do you have any way of looking at the recommendations that we are being bombarded with in terms of changes in schools and that kind of thing? And can you tie that into how that may or may not help with any of this?
For sure. So one major recommendation on the table centers around early childhood education. You heard it in the NWEA presentation, and I would offer that many of our challenges at the elementary, middle, and high school all are centered around foundationally early literacy, numeracy, and fortifying our early childhood arm in a way where we're sending more and more students to kindergarten and first grade ready to engage in grade level content and standards.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yes.
Thank you so much for the data. And along with you saying you wanted more thing, I wonder, I mean, y'all have got lexiles and quantiles. Is that another way to break it out and say what?
Right. It's the grouping. I mean, to be honest, we're looking at early childhood education is a slam dunk. But to look at some of the higher achievement ones,
I've got a second point.
yeah, but the higher achievement ones, they're not segregating the data enough to say you can be
Right.
achieving in a higher level.
But with respect to, I don't know if, it doesn't matter to y'all because we sign up for this. We are I don't know if you can imagine how much we're being bombarded by stuff. And 6 years ago, we voted on what the recommendation was for early childhood to fix everything. We would be seeing results by now, 6 years ago, based on the 2,000 seat expansion of CD classes.
Remember that?
Hadn't worked out, our numbers look similar. They are improving. I'm not disparaging. I only say this amongst this group knowing that I'm grateful for everybody. And but the maddest I have made somebody, and this has been moms and grandmothers, has been just telling them what our results are.
Yeah.
That is, they
That's
have been
it, yeah.
fired up, furious with me, and be like, well, you've been there for 6 years, you're part of the problem. And so I just want to convey that level.
You feel better now?
Yeah, no, that level of, we want to do the right thing. This board has demonstrated we will pay for whatever is recommended to move forward. I just want to make sure, obviously, y'all have got, there are a lot of, a filter to send things through, but we just want to make sure that that we don't get anything you don't think is going to work, or that we might be doing just because it feels good to do. So that.
Okay, Mr. Hollenshed, and we're going to wrap it up. No, you're good. You're fine.
Yeah, I just think it's deeper than that. I think we need to also look at management style. We just can't sit here and say we want to dump money into a pit. We need to look at what method we're delivering to the public. Just say you're getting phone calls. I get emails and calls too. But we owe a fiduciary responsibility to our public to make sure that we look at everything. And if we don't look at everything, I get tired of being saying that we're talking heads up here. So I got mine coming out soon, but, I'm not just talking.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm sorry.
Sir, may I just say a word about the two charts we did not discuss?
Okay.
The first one is from the report card ratings, and it's a really simple visual. You can look at each school and go across the page looking at the academic achievement rating, the social studies and science rating, the student progress rating from the state, whether that school is growing students or not. If you look at the first, second, third, fourth, fifth school down, you see it's an excellent school, but its growth was not satisfactory. If you look at the first column, below average, excellent, average, and so forth, that's strictly the academic rating. That may become important to you as we talk about some of the recommendations on the table, and I just want to, you could get this information by getting on the state website and looking up school after school, but this is just a handy, all-in-one document reference piece for you. When you see more than one red box across that line, that will tell you that it signals for us that things are not going as well in that school as we want them to. The other document is something that's unique, but is really important, and I want to make sure that we understand how to read it. It's the document that looks like this, that has all these boxes. We heard earlier today, we've heard all of our lives about the relationship between poverty and achievement and the role of public schools in changing that pattern. Each row shows you a school. It starts with Buist Academy. It compares any other schools like us, like Buist Academy in this region of Dorchester, Berkeley, and Charleston counties. Buist Academy has an 11.69% poverty rate. So the first column tells you that the achievement of all of those schools that have only 11.69% poverty is excellence. The next column shows you growth or progress. That shows you how much progress Daniel Island in Berkeley County, Merrington in Berkeley County, And then 3 other schools in that category in Charleston County are making versus Buste. And the third column shows you overall. I wanted you, if you would, to flip to just about the 4th page from the back. You'll find the middle school ratings there. I think it's maybe the 3rd page from the back. And you see a school that was mentioned just a moment ago. You see Simmons Pinckney. Simmons Pinckney sits with a 98.17% poverty rate. That is the highest poverty rate in the state for any middle school anywhere. There's no middle school in the state that has that kind of poverty rating. In fact, there were no middle schools in our region with that kind of poverty rating. So we had to go outside of our region across South Carolina looking at other middle schools with that poverty rating. We see that the achievement is unsatisfactory. The growth is average. There are 3 schools in the state that have better growth than Simmons Pinckney, but 3 schools that have worse growth than Simmons Pinckney. So that's the kind of analyses that we are doing are based on a number of factors. It's a very complex process trying to figure out where good things are happening and where they're not. We'll bring you any information you want, but I think what would be most helpful to you would be for us to bring you our analyses generalized with the rationale beneath them because of this and this and this, with as much backup data as you want, but there are hundreds and hundreds of pages that you have to go through to even get to this point. But this is one of the best documents I have ever seen. And I just want to make sure that we all understand how important it is because it looks at apples to apples. What's the poverty rating and how well are other schools growing children versus our schools? Because we intend to be the fastest improving school district in the state, and that means that every school has to be top of group in terms of the rate at which they're growing students. And that's the real challenge for us. We are not growing students as quickly and as adeptly as we need to in all of our schools. So thank you for taking just that little extra bit of time to talk about those documents.
Okay.
Dr. Postaway, in the NWEA presentation, thank you all for that, somebody asked a question and about how we compare, I think, to other districts. And the answer was that other districts in the country have achievement gaps, but there are districts out there that don't have the growth gaps. So did I understand that correctly?
I think the answer might have been there are districts out there that are growing children a whole lot more than we, and they see a different pattern. It's not common to see that the highest performing students are growing the most and the lowest performing students are growing the least. That's the uncommon pattern.
Okay. So are there ways for us to look at the NWEA data for districts that are growing their kids successfully and
right, that was the primary part of the research
Okay.
that NWA was going to help us with, as well as
Perfect.
looking at the programs that we're using. It was at one point nationally we moved to a balanced literacy approach. Teachers generally didn't have a lot of materials to use that were prepared for them to teach literacy. We asked classroom teachers to develop those materials, and in the process, we lost an emphasis on phonics that's absolutely essential for children who come from homes where they haven't had the opportunity to have a lot of books read to them, for example.
Reverend Combs.
Thank you for it is good information, and I get to know about the poverty level, which could affect learning, but not dictate learning.
We agree.
Yeah. When I'm just considering the mission critical plans, and which Priscilla mentioned a while ago about doing something differently. And when I consider those mission critical plans, then I ask myself the question. I said, well, what have we tried that didn't work, or what new initiatives have we put in the classrooms already that we can evaluate? Have we put in any new programs? Have we really ramped up our reading program, our math program? Have we really went to work in our classrooms and said, well, we failed, and now we need partnership or privatization or something different or closed schools? I mean, honestly, I'd like to be able to reach and say, well, to the community, say, well, we tried this program A, but it didn't work, and we also tried program D, but that didn't work. I'd like to see us try something ourselves and evaluate that to see what works in the classroom before we make decisions that we may regret, because North Charleston will receive one of the biggest brunts of the impact of your plans, that schools will be closed and combined, and some will be taken over by private partners. So I'm very concerned about that. All right. You don't have to give a response, but now.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation today. This will conclude our workshop. We will resume back at 4 p.m.